Story 1. The Smiling Stranger. It was around midnight when I decided to take a walk through the quiet streets of my neighborhood. It was something I did often when I couldn't sleep, a way to clear my mind. The streetlights buzzed softly, casting long shadows on the pavement, and the world felt still as if I was the only one awake. As I turned the corner onto an empty road, I saw him. A man stood under one of the streetlights, his back to me. He was tall, dressed in a tattered suit that looked decades out of style. His head tilted slightly to the side, as though he were listening to something I couldn't hear. I slowed my pace, unsure whether to approach or turn back. That's when he turned around. His face was pale, almost waxy, like a mannequin's. But it was his smile that froze me in place, wide and unnatural, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. His teeth were perfectly straight and blindingly white, as if carved from porcelain. "Good evening," he said, his voice soft but echoing unnaturally in the stillness. He didn't move toward me, didn't blink. He just smiled that horrifying smile. I managed a weak nod and tried to walk past him, but his head turned, following my every step. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice impossibly calm. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding, and every instinct screamed at me to get away. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. But no matter how far I walked, I could feel his gaze on me. When I finally dared to glance back, he was still standing under the streetlight, smiling that same unnerving smile. But then, as I turned a corner, I saw him again, standing ahead of me this time, under another streetlight. "How are you here?" I blurted out, my voice shaking. His smile widened, impossibly so. "I never left. I ran." I don't know how long or how far, but when I finally reached my house and slammed the door behind me, I felt a momentary relief, until I turned around. He was standing in my living room, his smile brighter than ever. Story 2. The Black-Eyed Woman. In my town, there's an urban legend about a woman who appears at the bus stop on the edge of the city. She's said to have long, dark hair and wears a faded red dress. People claim she only appears at night, sitting alone on the bench, waiting. The rule is simple: don't look into her eyes. One night, I found myself waiting for the last bus home. The air was cold and the streetlights flickered above me. I had almost forgotten about the legend when I noticed her, a woman sitting at the far end of the bench, her hair covering her face. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I tried to ignore her, focusing on the empty street, but I could feel her presence like a weight pressing down on me. "Do you know when the bus is coming?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft and melodic. I didn't answer. My throat felt dry and a chill ran down my spine. She repeated the question, louder this time, and I couldn't stop myself from glancing at her. Her head tilted up and I saw them, her eyes. They were black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like twin voids staring into my soul. My body froze and I couldn't look away. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice no longer soft but deep and guttural. The next thing I remember, I was waking up in my bed, my clothes muddy and my hands scratched. I don't know how I got home, but every time I pass that bus stop, I feel like I'm being watched. Story 3. The Phantom Broadcast. There's a story in my town about a radio station that no one can find. They say it only broadcasts late at night, somewhere between static and dead air. It doesn't have a name, just a haunting voice that tells stories, stories that feel uncomfortably real. One sleepless night, I decided to see if the legend was true. I turned the dial on my old radio, scanning through the static. At first there was nothing. But then I heard it, a faint voice almost drowned out by the hiss of static. "Welcome to tonight's broadcast," the voice said, calm and steady. "Tonight, we tell the story of a man who couldn't stop listening." I froze. The voice began describing a man sitting in his room, listening to a radio late at night. The details were eerily specific, down to the color of my walls and the way I was sitting. As the story continued, I realized it wasn't just describing me, it was predicting my actions. When the voice said, "He stood up and walked to the window," I felt an irresistible urge to do exactly that. When I looked outside, I saw nothing but darkness. Then the voice whispered, "He's watching you now." The broadcast ended abruptly, leaving only static. I smashed the radio the next morning, but sometimes in the dead of night, I hear that voice again. Story 4. The Disappearing Road. There's a road on the outskirts of my city that doesn't appear on any map. People call it the road that vanishes. The story goes that if you drive down it at night, you might not come back. Curiosity got the better of me one night and I decided to find it. After hours of searching, I came across a narrow, unmarked road that seemed to stretch into the darkness. My headlights barely cut through the fog as I drove, the trees on either side closing in like a tunnel. The road felt endless. The further I drove, the more I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. My GPS stopped working and the clock on my dashboard flickered, showing random numbers. Then I saw the figure. A man stood in the middle of the road, his face hidden by the shadows. I slammed on the brakes, but when I looked again, he was gone. Shaking, I decided to turn back, but the road behind me had vanished. It was just trees, dense and impenetrable. Panic set in as I kept driving, hoping to find a way out. Eventually, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Relieved, I pulled over and waited for the car to catch up. But when it did, it wasn't a car at all. It was the man, his eyes glowing in the dark as he ran toward me. The next thing I remember is waking up in a ditch by the highway, my car nowhere to be found. Story 5. The Masked Visitor. In my hometown, there's an urban legend about a man in a mask who knocks on doors at exactly 3 a.m. The mask is plain white with no features, and the legend says you should never open the door. One night, I stayed up late working on an assignment. When the clock struck 3 o'clock, I heard it, a single knock on my front door. My blood turned cold as I remembered the stories. I tried to ignore it, but the knock came again, louder this time. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. There he was, a man wearing a featureless white mask, standing perfectly still. I backed away, my heart racing. The knocking grew more frantic, almost desperate. Then it stopped. Relieved, I went back to my desk. But when I turned on my computer, the screen flickered and a message appeared, "You shouldn't have looked." Behind me, I heard the sound of the door creaking open,